What if the United States had never entered World War I? World War I was one of the most transformative conflicts in human history. Known at the time as the war to end all wars, its consequences shaped the course of the 20th century, affecting the global balance of power, economies, and even cultural identities worldwide. Central to the war's outcome was the late entry of the United States in 1917, a decisive moment often credited with tipping the scales toward an Allied victory. Join us as we speculate on an alternate timeline where America stayed on the sidelines, exploring the consequences for the war, Europe, and indeed the entire world. First, let's briefly recall why the United States joined World War I. For much of the war's early years, the U.S. maintained a stance of neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson advocated for peace, emphasizing America's role as an impartial arbiter in the conflict. However, two key developments shattered that neutrality. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, which targeted American ships, and the infamous Zimmermann telegram, where Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the U.S. Economic factors also played a role. American trade and loans heavily favored the Allies, and their defeat would have created substantial financial losses for the U.S. These motivations, coupled with public sentiment shifting after the sinking of the Lusitania, led to America declaring war on Germany in April 1917. But let's change history. Imagine Wilson never receives the Zimmermann telegram, or public outcry over submarine warfare dies down. Perhaps isolationist voices prevail, keeping the U.S. out of the fight. What happens next? Without American intervention, World War I likely would have evolved very differently. By 1917, the European powers were already battered from years of trench warfare. The Allied powers, Britain, France, and Italy, were struggling to maintain their offensives. American troops made a significant difference during their involvement. By mid-1918, nearly 2 million U.S. soldiers had arrived in Europe, bringing fresh reinforcements to exhausted Allied lines. Their presence boosted morale and accelerated the German collapse. Without this vital support, the war could have dragged on for much longer, potentially for years. Would Germany have used this extended timeline to press its advantage? Perhaps without the threat of new enemies, German forces could fully pivot their resources to the Western Front, having already secured a favorable peace with Russia through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. Or would both sides, weary of a war without end, have negotiated a ceasefire earlier, avoiding total devastation on all fronts? One major consequence of the U.S. staying out of World War I lies in the war's conclusion and its aftermath. In our timeline, the Treaty of Versailles was a punitive agreement dictated by the Allied victors. It imposed crushing reparations and territorial losses on Germany, humiliating the nation and sowing the seeds for World War II. With the balance of power remaining closer to a stalemate, a negotiated peace might have been more plausible. Rather than positioning Germany as the sole aggressor, resulting in punitive measures, the powers might have opted for a settlement more focused on compromise. This could have profound implications for Germany. Without the crushing burden of reparations, Germany's economy may not have experienced its catastrophic post-war crash. Additionally, the absence of such harsh political humiliation might have prevented the rise of extremist movements, namely the Nazis, who harnessed resentment over Versailles to gain power. Would Adolf Hitler have still risen to prominence in a Germany not defined by devastation and disgrace? Or might Germany's potential recovery and stability have halted the pathway to World War II altogether? These questions show how tightly history is woven together, with each thread pulling the next. Just as Germany's future would be different without U.S. intervention, so too would much of Europe's. The war radically redrew maps across the continent, elevating some nations while destroying empires. A protracted, unresolved war or a negotiated peace would have created very different fault lines. For example, without U.S. support bolstering Britain and France, these colonial powers might have wielded less influence in the post-war world. It's doubtful they'd have tackled the conflict with the same confidence, potentially weakening their positions on the global stage. This absence of dominance could have created opportunities for emerging powers, like Japan or the Soviet Union, to assert influence earlier and more aggressively. Moreover, a prolonged war would have only intensified the suffering of ordinary people across Europe. Shortages of food, resources, and manpower might have triggered even greater unrest, potentially fueling revolutionary movements similar to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Might other monarchies, particularly the British or French, have faced collapse as well? If America never enters World War I, the conditions that gave rise to World War II might look entirely different, or might not have existed at all. Two critical factors drove World War II: unresolved tensions from World War I and the global economic depression of the 1930s. A more balanced or less destructive end to World War I potentially eliminates the first factor. Meanwhile, reduced reparations on Germany could ease the financial strain that rippled through Europe and destabilized its economies, softening the second. That said, avoiding World War II doesn't necessarily mean global peace. Japan's imperial ambitions in the Pacific might still provoke conflict, especially as the US remained wary of Japanese expansion. And without the United States fully committed to global leadership, could European nations alone have effectively countered rising militaristic regimes elsewhere in the world? Alternatively, it's possible that conflict would erupt in new and unforeseen ways. Would a later clash of empires in the 20th century create an alternate version of global war, fueled by different actors and causes? The absence of US involvement in World War I would undeniably affect its rise as a global power. Before entering the war, the United States was largely isolationist, focused on domestic growth and hesitant to become entangled in European conflicts. By participating in the war and later helping shape the Treaty of Versailles, the US positioned itself as a key player in international relations. Without this foray into global politics, it's plausible the United States would have taken longer to emerge as a superpower. Its industrial and financial growth might continue, but its reputation as a global leader in both wars and peace would falter. Furthermore, institutions like the League of Nations, ambitious but flawed precursors to modern international organizations, could have been even weaker without US vision and support. Would the US eventually take on leadership during future global crises? Or might it have remained content with isolation, ceding influence to powers like the Soviet Union or a resurgent Germany? While the global implications of US neutrality in World War I are staggering, the effects at home would also be transformative. Wartime production fueled massive economic growth in key industries, such as manufacturing, transportation, and agriculture. Without the war, this expansion might have been stunted, delaying America's economic boom. Social changes, too, were driven by wartime needs. The demand for soldiers opened roles for women and minorities back home, sparking conversations about equality that carried into the following decades. A neutral US might have delayed these cultural shifts, resulting in a more conservative, less progressive society during the 1920s and beyond. Lastly, President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, most notably his advocacy for the League of Nations, might never have gained the spotlight. With no need to justify US involvement, Wilson's vision for international cooperation would hold less sway, potentially delaying or altering the development of global diplomacy in the 20th century. Beyond politics and war itself, US involvement in World War I had significant cultural and technological consequences. For instance, the war accelerated advancements in aviation, medical science, and communications technologies. Without US participation, would these developments have been delayed? Could American innovation in these fields and others like mass production have taken a slower path? There's also the question of cultural identity. World War I marked a turning point in how Americans viewed their nation's role in the world. It sparked a sense of patriotic duty and readiness to confront global crises. In this alternate timeline, where the United States never enters World War I, the rewoven threads of history reveal just how interconnected the past is. Every event, the collapse of empires, the rise of new powers, and even the world wars themselves, feeds into a broader web of decisions, consequences, and turning points. Would the war have ended in a fragile peace that delayed future conflicts? Could Germany have emerged stronger, Europe weaker, and the United States slower to assert its global leadership? Or might an entirely different chain reaction of events have plunged the world into a completely different kind of chaos? While we may never know the answers, exploring these hypotheticals reminds us of the delicate balance upon which history rests. The United States' entry into World War I shaped the world as we know it, but imagining the alternatives helps us appreciate the complex forces that drive both history and the future. For now, we can only speculate. What do you think? Would a neutral America have changed the course of history for better or worse? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay curious about the possibilities of the past. Like and subscribe for more from History Twist.